Good morning. I'm Chris Wood, editor and publisher of BizWest, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Diversity and Inclusion Small Business Toolkit webinar, the second installment in a webinar series on diversity presented by BizWest. Smart business leaders know that creating inclusive, diverse workplaces isn't just the right thing to do. Research indicates that diverse teams are more creative, more innovative, and higher performing. Embracing a diverse workplace has been shown to increase an organization's bottom line, making you better qualified to serve diverse customers and communities. Our goal for this webinar is to provide tangible information and inspiration for small businesses that seek to build a more diverse and inclusive culture within their organizations. I would like to first thank our sponsors for this webinar series, including Anthem, Bold Font, and Delta Dental. We could not produce events such as this without their support. The discussion in the United States surrounding diversity and racial justice has been painful. Since the tragic death of George Floyd on May 25th, and with new attention to the death of Elijah McClain in Aurora, along with far too many numerous other instances, many eyes have been opened to issues of racial injustice in our society. For many small business owners, it has led to self-examination of their own workforces in terms of diversity and inclusion. Today, we look forward to advancing that conversation with 4 leaders on the subject of diversity and inclusion. Lauran Arledge is the CEO of Bold Font Coaching. Bold Font exists to guide organizations in creating exceptional leaders at every level and developing and maintaining healthy, thriving cultures. Lauran has spent the last 2 decades leading diverse teams in the education, public health, and technology spaces, where she drove breakthrough results by designing and delivering complex, people-centered programs. Elizabeth Rita read every Nancy Drew book as a kid as soon as it came out, which might have provided a clue about where her professional life would take her. Liz has been providing impartial investigations to clients in Colorado and around the country since 1994. She specializes in complex investigations in the workplace, and her practice has run the gamut from workplace culture evaluations, class-based discrimination investigations, hostile work environment, retaliation, whistleblower, ethics violations, rape and sexual assault, executive misconduct, and corruption investigations. Liz sits on the board of directors of the Association of Workplace Investigators and is the co-author of Workplace Investigations in Colorado, a practitioner's guide to Colorado employment law. Peter Salas is the chairperson of the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Boulder County. Pete began his public career as a community organizer and has been actively involved in community affairs his entire career. He has served on more than a dozen nonprofit boards, as well as having served on a city council and school board. Pete was a founding member of the Boulder County Latino Chamber and has served on the Boulder Chamber of Commerce and the former Minority Business Leadership Council. He has also been actively involved in local politics and has helped organize 3 different Latino-focused political organizations. And Glenda Strong Robinson is an executive committee member of the NAACP of Boulder County. She is a longtime resident of Longmont, where she founded an award-winning facilities maintenance company in 1983. She is a graduate from California State University, Long Beach, with a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice. She is also a graduate of Leadership America. At the height of the civil rights movement, Glenda was an impressionable young junior at Memphis State University. While there, she became an active participant in civil rights activities led by Dr. King just before his death, and has since worked tirelessly to make a difference whenever possible. And we're going to start with Peter Salas. So I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Pete, and we'll get going with our conversation today.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to put this screen up. It's a quote from Victor Hugo. It said, "Nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come." Unfortunately, this time I've had this out several times, and it's but I like to remind people that that there's no time like the moment. So I'm going to preface my remarks by just saying that what I'm going to present today is really, I think most HR people are aware of it. A lot of it's not new, but I just kind of want to reiterate what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this, and then be glad to answer any questions as we go through it. And the basic question, and I think Chris alluded to it earlier, is why do we want or need to talk about diversity and inclusion? And you know, it's among other reasons, from a business perspective, it's really to maximize our profits in a pluralistic society. And in order to do that, we have to have diverse and inclusive workplaces. And the issue really belongs to everyone, and not just business people, but the community in general. I'm going to go through a few things here and just kind of not spend a lot of time on the next few. We always get a question, what do we mean when we say diversity? And so it means a lot of things to different folks. And the, oh, I lost the slide here. There are what we call primary or immutable dimensions of diversity. And most of you are familiar with these: ethnicity, gender, age, physical ability, race, sexual orientation, sexual identity. We call them immutable because these are dimensions of diversity that we were really born with and do not change, relatively speaking, during our lifetimes. There are other dimensions, and this list could go on. Things like educational background, geographic origin, income, marital status, parental status, religious belief, work experience, and of course, depending on your particular situation and how you encounter life or construe difference, this list can go on even longer. When we talk about how do we create diverse workforces, it's really, and again, most of you, a lot of you are familiar with this. I'm going to reiterate. Let's talk about recruitment. That's really where it begins. And the first thing I like to talk about, and I could change these around, but is, you know, what is your recruitment zone? And that will vary depending on the nature of your business, the type of recruitment or employees that you hope to have work for your business. Is your zone a local zone? Are you looking to capture, get local employees? Is it a statewide recruitment zone? And in some cases, for your larger companies, there's a national recruitment zone that that you really reach out to. And so it's important that you know what it is, because it's going to influence a lot of other decisions you make in terms of how you recruit. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about recruitment are what are your recruitment tools. There are a number: social media, print media, television, radio, community networks, etc. This is important because when you're reaching out to diverse populations, we don't often think about it, but different ethnic populations see social media differently and use it differently. As an example that we've encountered at the Latino Chamber, we find that a lot of our population, in terms of social media, really relies on Facebook as opposed to other tools. Again, a lot of it's depending on what you're looking for. There are other, as I think most of you are familiar with, LinkedIn, some other tools. A surprising number of people actually listen to the radio, at least in the Hispanic Latino population here in Boulder County. Again, there are other forms. So just understand the population that you're recruiting from and what their where they get their information from. Various perspectives will play an important role in your ability to attract the type of talent that you want. Talk about who's doing the recruiting. Oftentimes, if you're a larger company, you have HR staff that's doing it. So if you have HR staff that's doing your recruiting, a lot of this will sound familiar. You will already be familiar with it. And again, where your recruiting zone will tell your HR staff where they want to look. Do you use a search firm? I think the larger The larger entities often employ search firms, in which case they look at the list of people, they do all the outreach, you provide them with the qualifications and requirements that you need. A lot of small business, really, the owner does recruitment, and that recruitment will take a number of forms, including reaching out to friends and family, other folks in the community, and so it's a whole different take on what your recruitment looks like if the owner's doing the recruitment. Again, the owner may use some of the other recruitment tools depending on their familiarity with the community and the tools to be used. I put designated staff here because in some organizations, there are staff that are designated to do recruitment. There are outreach staff that have community connections or whose task it is to engage in recruitment activities. I put who's the messenger because it's important, particularly as it relates to the Hispanic Latino community. If you're outreaching to the multilingual communities and you have a need for bilingual staff, it's important that you have bilingual staff out doing the outreach work. And so there's a difference between, we make the difference in the community between bilingual staff and bilingual bicultural staff. Bilingual staff may have a command of the language, but bilingual bicultural staff not only have a command of the language, but also are familiar with the cultural nuances of the population, and usually are members of the community that you're outreaching to. I put number 5 there. I added that in qualifications, credentials versus experience. What we've seen nationally over the last decade or so is that the reliance on the credentials, such as a bachelor's degree or a college degree education, has decreased in favor of really looking at experience and what people bring to the table around their experience, community involvements, and things of that nature. So we've seen that a lot of corporations, a lot of governmental entities put experience as one of the top criteria, as opposed to strictly educational credentials. So it's important when we talk about that, because oftentimes people are screened out because they don't meet the minimum requirement of having a degree of some type, particularly a bachelor's degree, and it's oftentimes you will miss good people if that's the criteria, because you'll rely on it instead of experience to do the job. I'm going to get around, kind of close a little bit with the notion that you need to build partnerships with organizations and with the community. This is a real key, particularly if you're well, at any level, particularly if you're recruiting at the local level, because you really have to understand that networking and building relationships with outside organizations is important. There are a number of organizations in Boulder County that, in particular, and some larger affiliates of the organizations, like the NAACP. There are Latino organizations, like the Latino Chamber of Commerce. Statewide, there are other organizations, and there are different affinity groups for the different levels of diversity that you're looking for. And so it's important that you reach out, you partner with community organizations, and become familiar with them, know what their reach is, know who are key contacts within those organizations, so that in your recruitment efforts, they become really key partners in reaching the diverse groups that you want. There are a number of organizations. I personally maintain lists of people in organizations. The people come to me on an individual basis to reach out, and so I keep lists, and it's important that as an organization, as a business, that you know who those organizations are that can help you. The other areas include participating in multicultural events. There are a lot of events occur over during the course of the year, not so much with COVID, but these days. But know what those events are. Oftentimes, these events have sponsorship agreements. They have vendor agreements, and it's important that you participate and understand the communities that you hope to recruit from. I think it's a key, letting people know that you're there and that you really care about diversity and inclusiveness. The utilizing local cultural brokers. It's not a term that most people are familiar with, but cultural brokers are those go-betweens between the community and the entities, whether be they businesses or other nonprofit organizations. Here in Boulder County, there are a team of people who are known as cultural brokers within our community, and they can provide key insights into the community. They can provide invaluable contacts. They can provide outreach information, and so really, I think you really need to find out who those cultural brokers are in our communities. They exist basically within every dimension of diversity, and can be invaluable in helping to recruit the individuals and talents that you want. Lastly, I put on here, and I know there are other areas, but word of mouth, employee word of mouth. You have employees who, if you have some diversity within your workplace already, you have employees who can help you or assist you in reaching out to community. It's important that you build a relationship with your employees so that they feel comfortable referring your business or organization to friends and others in the community. So those are a few things. I want to close with my presentation. Like I said, I could go on about this, but just a word of retention is the other side of recruitment. I think somebody had asked about how you prepare a workplace, and for about 18 years I did onboarding for cultural awareness onboarding and a day-long seminar on how you prepare your workplace to be an inclusive workplace, with the key being that once you recruit diverse communities, you want to keep those communities. You want to keep those employees, and oftentimes we don't spend enough time thinking about the inclusiveness part of this equation and what you do within your organizations to make it an inclusive, welcoming environment for your employees. The benefits are immeasurable in terms of production, and as was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation with Chris, if you're going to maximize your business opportunities, your public face in the community, you really have to talk about how you keep employees and the type of environment that you create. I personally do consulting around that. There are others in the community who can help you with that. Depending on the size of your organization, your onboarding process will look a little bit different, but in the end, it's worth the time and effort that will be required. That's the end of my presentation. I'm glad to answer questions around that, talk about other things that you can do around and not only recruitment, but retention, and how you in fact create an inclusive workplace and a positive face to the community understanding. Right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. There's some great insights and great ideas for our audience. I do want to mention, as Pete said, we will take questions. We will do that at the end. I would encourage the audience to use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit questions for any of our panelists, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can. I know that some audience members actually submitted questions as part of the registration process, so we will attempt to get to those as well. But please be mindful of the Q&A tool and submit your questions. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Lauran and Liz, who are going to tag team the next presentation. Lauran and Liz, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I will get our slide deck loaded here. And sorry about that. I'm just going to have to do this a little bit less seamlessly than we did in the previous presentation. So in any event, thank you so much for being here. Can everyone see our presentation now?
Yes, we see it.
Great, great. It's a pleasure to be here, and what a great introduction to this concept of building the most diverse and inclusive workplace environment. Pete provided such excellent tips on retention and on recruitment. And what Lauran and I hope to do in our session today is talk to you a little bit, give you some practical advice about the insights into not doing this proactively. I do workplace investigations, so I come in when this stuff hasn't been done right and when the culture of the organization has become dysfunctional. Lauran comes in after I do to try to help remedy that. And what we hope to do today is give you some insights into the cost of not doing it proactively, some tips for recognizing if your workplace is at a greater risk of these problems occurring, and then some remedies for creating and maintaining the best inclusive culture that you can in your particular organization. So we don't need to look much farther than the current headlines to see some of the risks that can happen if your culture doesn't do the right thing in terms of including and focusing on diversity and inclusion. These are just a few headlines we pulled from recent times. I don't know how many of you followed the story from San Francisco that happened, I think in June of this year, where a man and a woman out on a walk confronted a Filipino gentleman who was stenciling Black Lives Matter near a property. And the woman got on her phone and called police and indicated, I know who lives here and this is private property. Well, you know, it turned out that the person who lived there was the person who was leaving this message, Black Lives Matter. That person ended up losing their job at a financial services firm. Just last month, you probably all heard about the CEO of Wells Fargo, who in a meeting made the statement, it might seem like an excuse, but the unfortunate reality is there's a limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. He immediately had to walk that back. And since that just happened in September, we don't know what the cost will be for the brand. The founder of Papa John's pizza chain, this happened a couple of years ago, but made a comment about, you know, the kneeling during the NFL games during the national anthem and, you know, how that negatively impacted his business. He lost his job. His stock took a 25% hit. You know, these are all real world implications of getting this wrong inside your workplace. And frankly, what's interesting to me about it is how much the world has changed, right? I mean, I've been doing this work for 25 years and social media has enhanced the amount of reputational harm that can happen when these things go wrong. So these kinds of things can happen. And then what sometimes ends up occurring is you have to call in someone like me because it's gotten to a point where you've got a problem. You have to look at that problem and there are real costs to that. So I want to give you a little rundown of some of the costs that will occur if someone like me has to come into your workplace. You may have to do an investigation. And for those of you who haven't been through a workplace investigation, particularly let's say one that does have some visibility and does have some risk to your brand or involves high-level executives, et cetera. When an impartial investigator comes into your workplace, you have lost control in a sense because that investigator's got to do their job in an impartial way, meaning they choose who they're going to speak to. They choose what documents they get to look at. And they have to do enough to reach a thorough and complete finding. Guess what this does to a business? Not only is it incredibly disruptive, but your productivity and those sorts of matters can just come to a screeching halt. I would say 6 to 8 weeks of upheaval of your business is not unusual. What else can happen if things go bad? Well, there can be turnover. There can be turnover because somebody needs to be fired as a result of their conduct. There can also be turnover because people get very upset about these investigations. You know, when we come in, we do our best to keep things as discreet as we can, but you know, how many of you have been in the workplace longer than a couple of days? You're going to know that when something upsetting happens in the workplace, people are going to talk about it. And this can create a lot of dissension. As I mentioned, your productivity and your focus of your team is going to decline. You will have teams that perhaps now have difficulty working together. You know, Humpty Dumpty might have fallen off the wall and things are in pieces at this point. And even though, you know, there are times when you've got to do an investigation, it may be legally required to find out if there's some sort of unlawful discrimination going on. You may not have a choice, but guess what? If there had been some proactive work at the start on your culture, maybe you would never need to see me, and, you know, maybe I'd close my doors. And in some sense, after 25 years, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. This is the time when you're letting strangers rearrange your underwear drawer. It's a very apt metaphor, because if I'm in your workplace and I need to know what's going on between people, I may need to be reading all your instant messages, your text messages, your email. Some of those may end up as an exhibit in my report. And by the way, you know, this isn't even litigation yet. So litigation is what I'm doing on steroids in a way, but you're going to have to let a stranger come in and look at confidential things about your business. Obviously, from the slide previously with the headlines that we've seen, the reputational harm is huge. And all of this impacts your ability to retain a diverse workforce and to attract them in the first place. Not to mention the cost. In my shop, an average investigation costs about $25,000. That's no small potatoes. We have small businesses all the time who, you know, are really stunned by the cost. And unfortunately, you know, this is probably on the low side nationally. So if you're tuning in today from, let's say, California or some other coast, the cost could be double that. And so again, not even litigation. Once we get to the L word, and I will say I'm a recovering lawyer, I'm almost all the way better. I don't have to do this anymore, but when I did, I will tell you that it's a painful experience if you've got to go through litigation. Over the last 20 years, these claims have increased over and over exponentially. This has happened for a variety of reasons. People know their rights, for one thing, and people are tired of staying silent in the face of mistreatment. We saw this with the Me Too movement for sure. I saw this statistic online. I thought it was interesting. You're more likely to be sued than you are to have a fire in your workplace. And guess what? This isn't just a problem for big employers. This isn't just the big litigations that we hear about on CNN and on the news. 41% approximately are employers of 100 employees or less. Most of these cases settle. 75% is sort of the national average. I would tell you, knowing the United States District Court in the District of Colorado, they only hear approximately 30 civil trials a year. And I think in 2018, the statistic was something like 3,700 civil claims were filed. So that tells you 3,700 are filed, they hear 30 trials. You know, it's far more than 75% are settling here in Colorado. And what that means for you as a business is oftentimes that someone's got to get a checkbook out to either settle a claim that's really serious and would cost the business a lot of money, or to just make it go away. And once you're in trial, flip that coin, because 51% of the time employees win. I would say in Colorado, in our district court, If there's a retaliation claim that's happening, that number is going to be higher than 51%. Discrimination claims tend to do a little less well in our district court, as we have a fairly conservative jury pool. It's the whole state of Colorado. But retaliation claims go forward with great success here. And you know, if you're in the situation where you're in trial, it's not just lost wages that an employee can seek. They can seek emotional distress, mental anguish. They can seek punitive damages. These things can increase your liability. There are some caps, statutory caps on what people can get for these extra sorts of damages, but there's still a lot for a small business. I think it's $50,000. And so that's not small potatoes, right? And as I've mentioned, you know, social media and movements that are happening in today's world, they will intensify the reputational risk of finding yourself in this situation. And the last thing I want to mention about litigation statistics and risks is that, you know, the average length of time that you're going to be embroiled in this, and you're going to be deposed, and you're going to have to sit there and have a lawyer ask you questions, and perhaps you're going to have to testify, 3 years. And that is a long time to have to be dealing with something that perhaps could have been nipped in the bud. I'll say that having done this work for a very long time, there are always, you know, different idiosyncrasies in environments that I can look back on and say, hey, that had a role in getting us to the point where there was, you know, an investigation, and then perhaps there was litigation. But as I thought through it for purposes of today's conversation, I really thought there are 3 main things I see in almost every workplace that explains to me why it got to the point where I had to walk through the door. And I think these are important, because if you've got your antenna up and you're noticing any of these things, it tells me that your workplace is at greater risk of having some of these concerns. We hear this over and over and over again when we meet with complainants. No one listened to the person when they brought forward concerns, or perhaps they listened and then nothing happened. No response by the employer to this set of concerns. Or at the end of the day, nothing changed as a result of the problem. So when you look at the statistics of why people sue their employers, I think popular sort of sentiment would tell you, oh, it's because they're just trying to get money. Believe me, having been through litigation, it is the most uncomfortable and awful experience for everyone, even when you win. And at the end of the day, people want to be heard. If they have a problem, they want to know that you care about it. They want to know that you're going to do something in response to it. I have a good friend in town who's a plaintiff's lawyer, and I talked to him about this, and he said, you know, people come to me because nobody was listening to them. So thinking about how your culture sets up opportunities for people to bring forward concerns and have them addressed is of utmost importance. The other thing we see pretty frequently is a workplace where low levels of incivility and disrespect are allowed to go on unchecked. And I'm not talking about unlawful harassment or discrimination at this point. I'm just talking about people being disrespectful and incivil to one another. We call it the gateway drug to harassment, because if you look back at an environment and you say, you know, the fact that people were using disrespectful language, cutting each other off in meetings, speaking over one another, that sort of told me about the nature of the environment. And let's face it, you know, when somebody feels spoken over at work, when they feel disrespected, these are things that get people thinking about, how am I going to be heard? How am I going to be in a situation where I can be comfortable at work? What we've seen after the Me Too movement is a lot of workplaces amending their harassment policies to prohibit more than just unlawful harassment. When you think about it, you know, that's the basement level. It's like, don't do anything at work that's illegal. You know, I hope that people are expecting better from their employees than just avoiding unlawful conduct. And many employers are doing just that. They're amending their policies to require people to be civil and to be respectful to one another. You know, the EEOC came out with a really interesting study in 2016 looking at harassment in the workplace. There's a great report about it online. The task force for, I think it's called the Task Force Report for Sexual Harassment. It's from 2016. And this is something that they identify over and over again. A workplace that tolerates disrespect is just heading for a problem that's going to require an investigation and perhaps litigation. And then the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Lauran for some more positive news, we find over and over again in our work, if somebody had asked one question at some point in the chronology, had stopped and scratched their head and thought, you know, that doesn't sound right to me. I wonder why she said that. I wonder why this person paused when they answered my question about how everything was going at work. If someone in HR, if a manager or supervisor had just had the appropriate level of curiosity, that can sure stop things in its tracks, because it can tell you a lot about what's going on before it gets to a really critical point. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauran.
Thank you, Liz. All right. So Liz really highlighted for us sort of the cost of this and the risk. And one of the things that I think is really important to reiterate is just this idea that oftentimes when I go into work with CEOs and COOs and HR around culture, you know, they're like a little shocked around the price tag. And what I always like to bring up is, you know, do it now or do it later, right? And and this is really the proactive side of things. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about is just how you can start to develop a really strong organizational culture. So cultures exist regardless of whether or not you do it purposely or organically. And so what we always try to do is move all of our clients' cultures into this thriving space. But you can see this, it evolves in a spectrum, right? So you have at the far end on the left-hand side, you have dysfunctional. And this is where people are abused, harassed, and slighted. And these are the things that, you know, Liz is beginning to start to be engaged when these things get reported. In sort of this neutral zone where people sometimes can't articulate what's going on, there's things like people being left out or ignored or just simply tolerated. And then we move into this thriving category. You see people as respected, they're included, who they are is really embraced. And at the end of that, the most thriving cultures, everyone is truly valued. And so I just like to use this spectrum as a framework so that people understand how it works together. All right. You can go to the next slide. All right. The other thing that I find is that many folks don't necessarily understand how in diversity and inclusion and equity work really is based in human psychological needs. And so I use something as one of our kind of Northern Stars as our, when we're looking at all of healthy cultures, this idea of ARC. That's how you can remember it easily. And there's 3 parts to it, but I'm going to focus on relatedness. So the first one is autonomy, right? At every level of our development, we have a need to make choices and feel these choices are our own, to be self-directed in everything that we do. The second is relatedness, so our need to feel connected to other individuals without an ulterior motive. And then competence, that we know we can do what's being asked of us. But right in the core of that, because we are social beings, this relatedness idea is key. And a lot of organizations think that this just happens organically, and sometimes it does with the right leadership. But when we talk about the need to feel connected to other people, the need to feel as though we're seen for who we are in an organization and that is valued, it's pretty key to us. And so when we talk to folks who are not feeling seen or are feeling like they don't necessarily belong, this is one of those areas that we can really key into. And Peter made a great point around retention. And this is the retention piece, right? This is the retention part of, I see you, I celebrate you, you're valued in this organization. And so just keeping in mind that this is not just stuff that's new, right? The self-determination theory in our human psychology has been around for decades and decades. We know this stuff. And so using some of this information to really help build those strong cultures is key. You can go to the next slide. All right. So in our organization, we do coaching around leadership development, and we really treat, and we do coaching also around diversity. And so, and what that really focuses on is around identifying privilege and understanding some diversity factors that you may be blind to, depending on sort of where you sit. So we treat diversity as a leadership competency. It absolutely is imperative that all leaders understand inclusion and diversity and equity in the workplace. And so through my years of work, I worked as a teacher, I worked in community organizing and public health and violence prevention, and then in corporate settings before founding my own practice, is that there's something really cool around public health, in that we know that there are protective factors that protect organizations, that protect communities from falling into the traps that Liz so informatively told us about. And they're not surprising, but they do take a lot of discipline. And so the first one that we find is that people need to be able to develop really strong, high trust relationships. And there are specific things you go through and skill sets that you can build around building those high trust relationships. And those are imperative because with high trust and your high trust accounts, then when something isn't quite working or you make a mistake, it doesn't take you down into this really negative place where things become really hostile. You can sort of weather that. You have more ability to weather that event. So the other one is that we see, and this is again one of those pieces that we don't necessarily think through on the front end of a problem, is really advanced learning on bias and identity formation. And so in our practice, we talk a lot about educating folks about not only identifying their own bias, but also understanding how our identities are formed and how people come to work with very different identities and how you can begin to be inclusive about those things. The other thing we find that's really important is the idea of teaching people first about what boundaries are. You'd be surprised how few people really understand identifying their own boundaries, and then those communication of those boundaries in a way that feels comfortable and asserts yourself regardless of the level that you find yourself in the organization. And so one of the things we know about really healthy work environments is that employees are allowed to articulate a boundary regardless of the level that they are at, and that when those boundaries are articulated, they are respected and listened to. So this looks like, hey, you know, I'd rather have a handshake than a hug, thank you, right? That's just a simple example, but those are the kind of things that people need some help understanding how to articulate those boundaries so it feels comfortable. And this next one, you know, is super important. And again, one of those things that when I come in after Liz and try to sort of help the cultures come back together, over and over again, this is one of those pieces that we identify that there was a lack of awareness or a blind spot around. And that was really this idea of power and power differentials. And realizing how your role changes as you develop in an organization and how your responsibility changes. And we also work a lot on how to be an active bystander, how to understand or interrupt that basic sort of disrespectful behaviors, or when people are talking over other people, or if you see something, having the skills to understand when to act and when to escalate that concern. And so these are areas that we know make a big difference in how sustainable that culture, that healthy culture is, and moving towards thriving. And then the last is really getting very good at perspective taking, being very curious and empathetic. And so when I work with folks who are interested in doing some privilege work and understanding, some of them call this whiteness coaching, some of our clients, I like to call it diversity or privilege coaching, is getting really good about, instead of saying there's something happening in the media or something in our community narratives that is off-putting, thinking like, what am I missing here? What do I not understand? And what do I need to educate myself on? This is imperative. And then really getting good at saying like, this is how this feels for me. How would it feel if I was lower down in the organization or I was a direct report? And thinking about how that might change, how power influences that, and all those different factors. And so this is a skill that can be built, and absolutely at every level of the organization can be built into the fabric of the culture to really do that protective factor and move you towards that thriving place where you don't have to spend 3 years working in a litigation, where you don't have to have a investigation come in and do this disruptive work. And so one of the things that Liz and I are really passionate about is getting organizations to think proactively about these things so that they don't have to pay the cost later. And so I'm going to end I know I kind of went fast, but I want to make sure that Glenda has plenty of time because she's got some great things to say. So that will be the end of our presentation. And thank you so much for taking time to listen.
Great. Thank you, Lauren and Liz, for that great information. And we are going to turn it over to Glenda. And Glenda Strong Robinson, very, very pleased to welcome you again to the webinar. I'm really looking to you to help us put this in perspective, Glenda. How did we get here? And I know you're going to provide some insights into how we got to this point in time. I'll turn it over to Glenda. Glenda, you're muted.
Thank you, Chris. It's an honor for me to be here, and it's an honor for me to share this platform with these illustrious presenters. And thank you for your information. One of the things that I like to think that I do is bring history to life. You know, a lot of people say history was really boring, but I hope I can change that opinion of it. Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I just want to kind of encapsulate, just kind of walk you through history, especially for Black people, because in 1619, 20 enslaved Africans arrived on American soil to provide free labor for white landowners. So America's founding fathers met in the late 1700s, forming a constitutional convention, thus establishing the United States of America in 1776. They wrote the Declaration of Independence, which states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that are among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Not every American's reality, certainly not that for African Americans, because then the discussion ensued over what constitutes a man. So we're going to jump fast forward to the 1800s, especially 1861, where we had a civil war between the states, or the Civil War. Several reasons for this war, and even that's up for discussion, but the most prevalent, I would say, being over slavery, and that was fought from 1861 to 1865, at which point Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves were free. One significant thing for me about that is that my grandfather was born in 1860. So he was an enslaved African American, but granted his freedom at age 5 in 1865 at the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. He went on to become a college-educated person and a college professor in our hometown back in Memphis, Tennessee. What's significant to the work force of this is that he had to stop work after teaching young Black kids for 51 years with no retirement plan. He had to rely on his 10 children to sustain him until he died. So we're talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace and all that, and it will become, I don't know, evident perhaps later on. So 1865, the Civil War ended. Then we had a Reconstruction period. Yay! The 13th Amendment was signed, granting freedom for Black people. Black people prospered, became self-sufficient, built businesses, served in Congress even. But then entered Jim Crow, a racist system declaring separate but equal. And this was throughout the southern states at the end of the Civil War. Blacks were denied access to mainstream society. This is parts that I know of as well. We could not attend schools with, or I'll say it this way, separate but equal was the definition of Jim Crow. So we had to attend segregated schools. I could not go to the parks, the pools, the restaurants, libraries, the fair, movies, ride in the back of the bus, as you remember. And then, of course, in 1955, Rosa Parks said, no, I will not give up. I'm tired. That's literally what she said. I can't give up my seat today. I'm just tired. Thus, the American Civil Rights Movement began, and it was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, stating that to dehumanize another human being was morally wrong. And so he vowed to fight this system with non-violent, peaceful protests. And you know that that was absolutely favorable and won many victories through that, that process. In 1960, the Freedom Riders then rode their buses across the southern United States because Blacks then earned the right to ride on transportation and sit anywhere they wanted to. And then I'm rushing on. 1963, of course, Dr. King delivered his infamous I Have a Dream speech, and also 4 little Black girls were murdered at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama by the KKK. In November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. 64, much loss of life. But what's significant about 1964 is the Civil Rights Act was passed. This act changed the lives of everyone in America, not just Black people, all people. It changed the way we assimilated, it changed the way we did things, it changed how we moved, and it integrated Black people into society. Then, of course, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, led by Congressman John Lewis and others, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge after they were beaten and scorned and humiliated on the bridge. They eventually ended up at the Capitol in Birmingham, Alabama, and the Civil Rights Act of 65 was signed. So in 68, 66, 67, 68, many Blacks were killed. Riots ensued because people were mad. And guess what? This is happening today. People are angry because they're still disenfranchised and still marginalized. And so Dr. King comes to Memphis to protest the inhumane treatment that men were receiving as garbage workers. They were being treated like animals, really. There's a lot I could tell you about it, but as you know, on the balcony of the Lauran Motel, he was shot and killed. I was in that march on March 28, 1968, the I Am a Man march for basic freedom, for basic being treated decently and like a human being. The march that you see here is the April 8th Memorial March, which is at the Smithsonian African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And I was quite surprised to find that there. It's at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis as well. But so I left Memphis in 1968 at the end of that semester and moved to Long Beach, California. I was there for 13 years, and then my husband was transferred with IBM to Longmont, Colorado. So another key thing in my life was that on June 2nd, 1981, I received the call that our nephew was killed at the hands of police with a chokehold. And so here we are. That was 39 years ago. Here we are, 39 years later with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and the 2 Latino guys that were killed that next month here in Longmont. That set me on a path of activism. And so we move on through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, times of challenge. Of course, in 2000, African Americans prospered. And in 2009, we elected the first African American president. So we thought that times would get better. But again, here we are talking about things like diversity, inclusion, justice, equality. And so these things are back up again. There's a saying that says if we neglect the history of our past, we are bound to repeat it. Thank you for raising the conversations and talking about these things. My question now is, after talking about it, what will we do about it? And I think I will just close by saying, I'm also a minister, and I won't pronounce the text and give you a sermon today, but I will say that it's important how we value and how we treat people. John Lewis said, if you see something wrong, if you see an injustice taking place, you have the moral responsibility to say something or do something. So the question is, and Dr. King also said it's a moral question. You know what to do. It's an individual question. When faced with right or wrong, justice or injustice, what will you do? So, and I say, I want to leave you with this. The most important, I believe, and significant thing that we can do is value people. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about work, we're talking about organizations and systems. And yes, it must begin at the top, but we have to learn to value people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenda. I think I could listen to you speak for hours. So I really appreciate your insights and helping us put that into perspective. I will warn the audience, we may go a few minutes over. I want to get to a couple of questions. I want to ask you, Glenda, when you look at this area, and you're in Boulder County. Boulder County has a very small population of African Americans. I believe it's about 1.5%. I think it's about the same in Larimer and not much more in Weld. Very, very low compared to even Denver, which is, I think, in the 9 or 10% range. But why? Why is that? And why is this area not more welcoming for the African American community to call home? And how does that affect small businesses that are attempting to diversify their workforce or desire to diversify their workforce?
You know, thank you for that question. I think it can be done. I think Black people are not here because, as you said, it really is not a welcoming place for them or welcoming for them to do, especially young people. I would say that. I am here. We came with IBM with a 3 to 5 year sentence is what we called it. We got 3 to 5 years. The I've Been Moved company gave us 3 to 5 years, but it's been 40 years for us. And I can say on the positive side that Longmont offers for me a quality of life that's second to none. But as far as finding young people, there just is not anything here, they say, for them to do, especially if you're young and single. If you're young, single, and Black, who else are you going to interact with? And what are you, you know, there's just nothing for them to do. However, we have to make an extra effort to reach out to people. You can go to various counties. You can go to Denver and offer people something. It has to add value to them and their lives, and the value to their own human life has to be expressed, is what I think.
Thank you very much. If I could ask Lauran and Peter to rejoin us as well. I want to get to a couple of audience questions. We won't go too far over our allotted time, but we'll go a few minutes. We did have a few questions that were submitted by the audience. Pete, I think you probably addressed this in your remarks, but there was a question from the audience: what makes a workforce diverse? And I believe you went through some of the different ways that different contributors to diversity. But I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on that just for a minute.
Yeah, just tell you, you know, as I indicated, recruitment's the first part of it, and Lauran and Rita, Liz talked about some other aspects of it, but the real key here again is it's one thing to recruit a diverse workforce. It's another thing to retain a diverse workforce, and as I indicated, retention of that diverse workforce really relies on how you create an environment that is respectful and welcoming. The key for me is in order to do that and to be successful at retaining a diverse workforce and to create that environment, it really is to, and I tell this to a lot of people, is to develop, the people in your workforce, from managers on down, need to develop a level of cultural competency that will enable them to see the difference, respect the difference, and understand what that difference looks like. So again, the real, you know, diversity and inclusion involves more than just having a diverse workforce. It involves, as was previously discussed by Lauran and Liz, the being able to create a workplace. And for me, a lot of it's around cultural awareness and cultural competencies, and managers have to be competent in those areas. They have to. So that's really where it's at for me, and there are a lot of ways to do that, but it has to be intentional. It has to be driven from the top, and it has to involve a commitment of resource to do the work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Peter. Lauran, we have a question. Is there a guide or template for diversity, equity, and inclusion training for new hires and existing staff? This is, I think, from someone who wants to know, is there a handbook that they can use, a guide that will help them through this process?
I mean, there are lots and lots of free resources out there, and I think that you know, I think Korn Ferry has some really good resources. I know McKinsey does, and Liz, you weigh in here if you have something. But I think this is something that a lot of people are grappling with right now, is how to onboard and write that into their handbooks and on their onboarding. And that's where we come in and do a lot of help in terms of you know, self-serve. I'm not aware of those things specifically, but I do know there are quite a few free resources out there that can help people really get informed and craft that. Liz, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, and we always end our presentations with like telling people where all the free stuff is, because there's just a lot of great, you know, with, you know, open licensing and stuff that's on the internet. For example, I'll give you one really great one. Facebook made their own implicit bias training public. You can go online and find the deck. You can find a video of them presenting this, and it is outstanding. So I have, you know, I won't say out loud what I've done with that and incorporating it into my own trainings, but let's just say that some of those concepts appear in my trainings now that I have gleaned from this open source content. So doing a Google search, if you're interested in putting together a bias training for your folks and you don't have a resource that you can tap to help you, or you can't afford that, check out the Facebook one, and there are others as well.
Great, thank you.
And if I might just very quick,
Sure, Pete.
Chris, there are, I spent a lot of years researching this, and for 18 years I did a day-long onboarding seminar really around cultural awareness and creating an inclusive workplace. And I have resources if people wish to reach out to me. I do some consulting around it, and I've had extensive experience just on this topic. as well as resource materials that people might utilize to, if they wish to. There are some templates, and I'm glad to share the info that I have around it. It's something that's been going on for quite a while, and so I'm glad to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pete. Glenda, when you look at what's happened here this year, I mean, forget COVID and the election and things like that, but in terms of the acts of racial injustice that we have seen, it's been shocking for a lot of people, a lot of white Americans, to see some of these actions that have occurred. As you look at the ensuing discussion that has taken place, the conversation that is taking place, does it give you any cause for hope?
We gotta have hope. Yes, to answer your question, yes, it does. And we've gotta have hope. That's all we have to hold on to. As I said, my own family was, well, my nephew, the oldest grandchild in our family, was stopped for speeding. He was a senior running back at Long Beach State. And the chokehold was used on him 39 years ago. So, you know, that's disheartening. But to see, I tell you, the hopeful thing is to see that there are all races of people who are coming together and saying, this is not right. We've got to do something. We've got to say something. And I think that that's happening in a very positive way.
Thank you. And Liz, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, I believe, that in the last 20 years that litigation has increased, I believe it was 400% in that time. Have you seen any statistics about what might be occurring this year? I know this litigation takes a long time to get through into the process, but do you believe that we will see increases really because of the additional attention, the additional light that's being shed on these activities?
Yes, you know, there aren't any statistics available yet that I could quote from, but I will tell you that what we see in our practice and in talking to my employment law colleagues, and our own prediction is that, you know, this will be the Me Too movement time for race claims. Just about every investigation that we have received in my firm in the last 3 months has had a race component. This was not the case before the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it makes sense to me. You know, people have suffered with mistreatment and been worried to come forward, and now they're not going to do it anymore. They're going to bring these concerns forward. And the cultural competence that you mentioned, Pete, is so important, because for HR people taking these complaints and for managers, particularly if you're not a person of color, it's really important to educate yourself about what racism looks like in the workplace. You know, no HR person's going to write a memo and say, you know, I'm not going to hire any Hispanic people for this position that you're going to find. It's much more subtle. And if you don't have that lived experience, you have a professional obligation of competence to go out and get some training and get some education, because businesses are going to see more and more of these claims. I think that as we saw an explosion after Me Too of sexual harassment claims and sexual harassment lawsuits, we are headed the same way when it comes to claims on race and national origin.
Great, thank you. Well, we are past our time. I'm going to end the webinar now. I want to thank each of you once again, Lauran, Liz, Pete, and Glenda. Thank you so much for joining us and providing your expertise. I want to also thank our sponsors once again, Anthem, Boldfont, and Delta Dental. Again, we could not put on these events without the support of our sponsors. We do have a couple of notes, program notes. A webinar survey will be sent to attendees to get your feedback about the presentation today. And you will also receive an archived link to a recording of today's webinar that will go to all attendees. Just a couple of upcoming BizWest events. We have Confluence, the Colorado Water Summit, coming up on October 22nd. That will be a virtual event. And Northern Colorado 40 Under 40 on November 5th. Thank you all very much. Thank you for our audience. And once again, thank you to our panelists.